Right, David, Michael, the Christ, Shayler. You've been conspicuous by your absence over the past 12 months, and it has been a 12 months, hasn't it? What with all the phone hacking, the economy's in absolute meltdown, and things that are you're probably more of an authority on than most other people, and that's the Arab Spring and the uprising in Libya and all stuff about Colonel Gaddafi. So we're going to touch on these points a bit later on, but as you are God's highest authority on earth, the question that really must be asked of you is, Tamara Eccleston, what the fuck?
Well, I could make some kind of intellectual comment about the sort of glibness of celebrity culture and the widening of wealth and poverty and so on, but I mean, with all people, you've got to bear in mind that they are an aspect of God, and in some ways they are playing a role for God. I'm not saying God necessarily encourages you to be a billionairess who's pretty empty-headed, but what I'm saying is that obviously we have to respect all people, and strange enough I do think Tamara Eccleston's one of 144,000, which, to be clear, is the incarnations, the reincarnations of Jesus, basically.
So basically, it's quite marked that you mention this sort of number at the moment, because we've just gone through a week where we've declared the 7 billionth soul on this planet. The odds don't seem very good, really. 144,000 due for salvation out of 7 billion. What's happening to the rest of the chaff?
Well, what people have got to understand is when the world changes post-2012, and that's still, as far as I'm aware, the date we're heading for, is that it makes it clear in various prophetic texts, including the Bible, that the world will either be split into 4 or 3. The fourth level, that's not mentioned in certain areas, is the idea of souls who cannot be redeemed. Now, personally, I don't think that's the case, even though we've got some very evil people on the planet at the moment. We've got people like Tony Blair, George Bush, who've been responsible for torture, for the unjustified killing of many people, millions of people across the Middle East. Those people can still be redeemed, even though they may look like they are pure evil. No man is pure evil, he commits evil acts, and as long as he sees those acts are wrong, redemption is possible, basically. And, you know, the Bible makes it clear there's no greater joy in heaven than to see one sinner redeemed, basically.
Right, so for the past 12 months, have you redeemed any sinners?
Well, that's not my job, that's their job. But when you read the Bible more closely, Jesus doesn't die on the cross to save mankind. He dies on the cross to give mankind the possibility of salvation. And again, it's people have free will. I can't wave a magic wand and give people salvation. It doesn't work like that. What I can do, though, is hope to inspire them and to show them some of the pitfalls and signposts on the journey. And I think particularly in the world we live at the moment, there is so much emphasis on group consciousness and identifying with groups that people have come to assume this is the norm. But to join to a group is in fact the devil's work, because you're no longer an individual deciding right and wrong for yourself. You're saying, actually, I'm going to elect other people to do that for me. And democracy can be translated, rather than as the rule of the people, as mob rule. And that really is what we have at the moment. We have the banksters, or the gangsters, and democracy, mob rule essentially. And this seems to take place by appealing to the very lowest common denominators in any given group, basically. Groups have no souls, therefore they're incapable of love, and they will inevitably carry out, or induce men to carry out acts that lead to repression and murder and torture. It's exactly what we see going on with the world at the moment. If there's a committee doing it somewhere, it's not somebody's responsibility. You know, the people in Britain will say, well, we elected a government, they went to a war in Iraq, not us. But they're part of that society still. They still benefit from all of that, basically. So anybody who's a part of the society of the UK has to know they've been supporting unlawful war, they've funded a system of torture, and above all, through acts of usury, have starved and created the circumstances of extreme poverty in the rest of the world, basically. So I'm actually saying to people, they've got to look into their own hearts. There's no good pointing the finger at people in the Middle East, the so-called terrorists. Under God's law, they're not terrorists. You are entitled under God's law to use force to repel force when people come onto your land, and that's what we have done. We are the terrorists there, and the people defending their own livelihoods and so on are brave people operating under God's law. And again, it is absolutely unremarkable in our society, and I mention this because the telephone hacking has come up, is that Rebecca Brooks, who was then editor of The Sun, had been editor of the News of the World, admitted to a parliamentary inquiry 8 years ago that the News of the World unlawfully paid policemen for information. And yet to this, we saw her arrest only this year in 2011. And as yet, as far as we're aware, there's no moves to bring her to trial. And that's with a confession to a parliamentary committee. Now it's my contestation that basically under Blair, who is, and people can ask me more detail about this, but he is the beast, the Antichrist of the book of Revelation, basically.
Let me stop you there, because I think that the subjects that you talk about, they're so overarching that we can end up sort of branching off and being really specific about stuff. But what I really want to know now is what you have been doing over the past 12 months, or what I want you to explain, because I have some insight in what you've got, because I have read the third and final testament.
Yeah, no, well, okay, I've actually gone missing for 12 months. Obviously, people out there wonder where I've been. I went to St Paul's last week on 2nd of November just to see what was going on down there, the protest stuff for myself. I was also doing stuff in London. And obviously people, and I have to say to people, look, I'm perfectly aware that when I disappear like this, people think I've gone off to do some sort of MI5 training or briefing or whatever for the next part of the mission. But I do have to point out to these people that make that accusation is I must be the only MI5 agent, according to their reasoning, who's calling for the abolition of MI5 and is aiming to bring down the bankers. So again, it's one of those things that doesn't actually hold any water if you actually bother to do a modicum of research rather than listening to your own prejudices, essentially. But over the last 12 months it's been clear from God that I was not ready to engage. Earlier this year I went into court to represent somebody in extraordinary circumstances down in Bournemouth, and for having the temerity to ask a judge if he was under oath, which is the equivalent of asking a policeman to see his warrant card. I'm a policeman, okay, can I see your warrant card? Judge, are you under oath? I actually found myself being not just taken from a courtroom, but manhandled from a courtroom by two guards who then tried to throw me downstairs. Got to the bottom of the stairs, the guy puts his hand on my neck, and he's strangling me. The other guy somehow cuts my leg. I mean, this is extraordinary. What's supposed to be a democracy in a civilised country, that someone who asks a judge purely for his legal bona fides or his lawful bona fides is treated like that. But I saw that this was obviously a sign from God that, I can carry on doing that if I'm blue in the face. I wasn't going to achieve anything with it. And God was showing me that. And therefore it was time to step back a bit. Now I have stepped back obviously quite a bit even since 2007. I've not really properly engaged since then. It may be the final meaning of 40 days in the wilderness is 4 years in the wilderness. But that's been deliberate as well. It's been deliberate to walk away from this and see how humanity gets on without the Christ. And I would say anybody, any reasonable human being out there, look at it. Which way do you think it's going? With all of these cuts, with the repression we've seen recently. And one thing obviously I must mention is the actions of the riot police at Dale Farm. These people aren't even squatters, for God's sake. They own the land. They have a right to that land. And yet we saw what could only be described as the stormtroopers coming in, using tasers on people, using excessive violence. And I'm sorry, this was a civil matter between the council and those people. Therefore the police had no right to intervene in that way. Those actions are unlawful, and I will gladly help anybody who's involved in that, any protester, anybody who lived on that land, in claiming rights off those individual officers, basically. They did wrong, they don't care what they were saying, unless they can produce lawful authority, which they can't because they don't understand the nature of lawful authority. They are committed an offence, they've broken the law, and they are thugs. They are people who seek to intimidate, use violence and use weaponry against people who are peacefully protesting for that most basic human right, a piece of land to call your own. I must describe the frustration of seeing that. I mean, obviously, when you want to engage, but you've got to listen to God. God sees far more than we see, far more than you might have let him on, as Jesus Christ, so he's not going to tell you very much at all. And again, if you think you know it, come and talk to me, because so far every human being I've talked to hasn't got a clue how to go forward, basically. Don't have the first idea of it. They're so wedded to these ideas of organisations and group consciousness and solidarity and community and all that kind of nonsense that's been long used by the Zionists to manipulate people and lead to the kind of world we're living in at the moment.
See, I'm going to stop you there, because that's really what I like about the third and final testament. And there are lots of things to like, and I'm not just being sycophantic. The thing that it's done for me is put the common law in context of, well, number one, it's explained the common law. As someone who's worked in the Babylonian legal system for the past 20 years, it's explained the common law to me in a framework that I understand. But I also know that most people who have the courage of their conviction whereby common law is involved have difficulties in reconciling it with the concept of God.
Absolutely. Well, this is the problem, is that you can't, the common law is God's law. Therefore, you cannot create a common law without God. Now, obviously people will say to me, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God, what do I do? And I will say that you are a human being who is self-conscious, therefore you have a conscience. You are capable of love, you are capable of deciding what is right and wrong. If you're not guided by God, I would say you've got to be extremely careful about these things, and of course you have an even greater an even greater duty to ensure that justice is done if there's no divine guiding principle, basically. So what I see in that, with people's rejection of God, and sometimes their hatred of God, and I've got to say this, I mean, I will talk about John Harris. I've talked to him, I've talked to him about this to his face. He's claims to be a proponent of common law, and he said to me that every copy of the Bible should be burnt and every church and cathedral should be pulled down. Now again, what sort of act of nihilism is that? I've never suggested banning a book, even though I've seen books in with abhorrent ideas. Newspapers, to me, day in, day out, have abhorrent ideas in. But that doesn't mean I ban them, it means I go and engage with them and prove their arguments are wrong. And that is the problem with this, he's got into that kind of group consciousness. And churches and cathedrals are beautiful buildings. To want to destroy that which is inspired by God and created by man, again, is the work of Satan. That beauty and truth are integral to our existence, that we actually have a buzz when we encounter these things. And to want to destroy them and replace them with what we saw in communism, the kind of brutalist buildings, destroys people's hope. It gives them nothing to work in. And we saw what happened when people put in high-rise buildings and everything. That they can't live like that. It's not a normal, natural lifestyle, basically.
Well, let me stop you there now, because I think you've just touched on group consciousness again, and I have to say, probably like a lot of people who will be watching this, the thing that sort of the tipping point for me was 9/11, and we've just gone through the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and I have to say, in the mainstream. There didn't seem to be any sort of banner carrying for truthers out there at all, even 10 years on. And I did find it quite ironic that the Daily Mail didn't carry anything to do with 9/11 being an absolute sham and an inside job, but there was a piece in there about you being right about Libya all those years ago. So that made me smile. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about 9/11 truth, the movement that seems to be stumbling, and the publicity therein, and how that relates to the failures of group consciousness as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously I was enormously disappointed to see on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 very little exposure of what is the obvious truth about 9/11. And let's just go back to some first principles here, shall we? The 9/11 Commission, who are tasked with getting to the truth about 9/11, do not mention the collapse of Building 7 that day. They mention Building 7 in the report, so they know it exists, but they don't even know it's collapsed. Now, the fact it's mentioned in the report, they don't mention the collapse, suggests to me they carried out the entire inquiry without realising a 47-storey building came down in New York. Now, if the inquiry was that dilatory about that, it's going to be dilatory about other things. But so go to anybody now and say, do you believe in the official story of 9/11? And they say yes. That means they believe that a 47-storey skyscraper that day didn't come down when all the evidence shows it did. This is an act of, extreme stupidity, basically.
See, that's
but can I just carry on to make the point? The test of any inquiry under law, is that if a new piece of evidence emerges that has not been looked at by that inquiry and is germane to what is going on, the inquiry must be reopened. So the inquiry now must be reopened to look at Building 7. We know the reason they obscured Building 7 for several reasons. One is it wasn't hit by a plane, so they can't even use that feeble excuse for weakening it. And secondly, it appears to be some kind of command centre. We know that Larry Silverstein, who owned the building, built some kind of reinforced building within Building 7.
See, that's my point now. I think we're sold on the idea of it being an inside job, totally. And that's why I feel so sort of frustrated at the moment. It has been such a tipping point for so many people that when we actually seem to get an activist group trying to bring this in front of people for a good few years, it still doesn't work. And in fact, There's nothing in the media now about it, and we're all accepting of oh well, the media are going to cover it like that anyway. How are we supposed to fight this if a national organisation with the backing that it's got and the publicity that it should have falls apart? How can we change anything at all?
Well, again, I say it requires activists to put the group consciousness to one side. This is how 9/11 was originally conceived. It was conceived as not as even a collection of people. It was individuals responsible for telling the truth in the way they saw fit. We were not there with any higher command or anything else. And that way of working, even it shocked me to start with. I was used to working in company structures and so on. I wondered whether it could work, but I was actually blown away by the enormous success of it. I mean, obviously I had a great story to tell. It was very easy to expose the lies about 9/11, which helped that. But nevertheless, that process was remarkable to watch it unfold, to see human consciousness changing. And I'm a firm believer that if you tell somebody a difficult truth, you give them 2 or 3 reasons why you believe that difficult truth. Much better to do that than give them some mealy-mouthed bureaucratic form of speak that may seem more initially acceptable, but is nevertheless just mealy-mouthed use of words, basically. It doesn't hit people in the same way as when you stand up there and bang a drum for your truth. That's what I did with 9/11 on public platforms. I talked to people, went over the country, and that worked. And we were getting in the mainstream media, basically. We got onto the Stephen Nolan show on Radio 5 Live, we were on Sky News, we were on the Jeremy Vine show, which is massively listened to, massively influential on Radio 2, basically. So what I was doing what no one else was doing in Britain with 9/11, getting into the mainstream media. Now obviously people talk about the article in the New Statesman in which I talked about there being no planes. I still stand by that no planes thing. I've had lots of 9/11 people come to me with this. I've discussed it with them, and not one of them has been able to come up with any piece of evidence that in any way hits at this theory. So I've stood my ground with that, and I did that for a deliberate reason with the New Statesman. I knew they'd run with it. I knew the other media would be tempted to run with it as well, to try and discredit me. But at the time it was the right tactic, because we were coming up against a stone wall. They can do this, they've got all the time in the world, all the money, activists haven't. They can just draw a line in the sand and say, right, no 9/11's getting in here, basically. And that's what they were doing. By doing this tactic with the New Statesman, by faking a defeat, if you like, a feign movement, like in war, what's known as a feint, they attack, and they can't resist then thinking, right, we'll have a go at Shayler. So they get me on the mainstream to fry me. But it didn't work like that, because I know that I can stand up to that and give the right answers. I also know there's going to be lots of people phoning in to phone-in shows and everything else. And whenever I was on, I put that straight evidence about 9/11. Phone in, 90% of people were always in favour of the fact that 9/11 was an inside job. That is how you start to change the world. 9/11 is not doing that at the moment, and that to me is the proof that these people are intellectuals living in group consciousness. They actually don't realise how the world is truly run, even though you think if 9/11 is an inside job and they're getting away with it, you might revise that. But at the moment we're going basically to the overseers as slaves, saying, would you please give us this? And of course the slave owners are saying to the overseers, no, they can't have that, because that's going to weaken our power. Why would you expect the slave owners to in any way acknowledge that? So you've got to use other methods, basically. You can't use the traditional methods of political discourse and political activism. As we've seen, that's all totally discredited. It doesn't change anything. 2 million people on the streets didn't stop the war. It's got to be more focused and cleverer than that. And using the common law, we have a way forward. And I believe that we can use submissions under the common law to get ministers to do their duty under the oath, basically. They have an oath sworn before God, and if you swear an oath before God, obviously you're bound by God's law. I don't think anybody argue with that, but perhaps I might do, I don't know. But to me, axiomatic, you've sworn an oath before God, you're bound by God's law, and God's law says that justice can't exist without truth. So if you don't have a proper inquiry into these things, there can be no justice coming from them. So that's what we will say, and we'll point out, for example, that they went into Afghanistan before even the inquiry into 9/11 had been carried out. Having gone into Afghanistan, they inquired. You could hardly say then that actually it's nothing to do with these people, it's to do with elements of the New World Order, because then the invasion of Afghanistan will be unlawful, as it is anyway. And again, I've been through this process. I've been quietly doing stuff behind the scenes in the last few months. I've been sending off little affidavits and notes to people, to various secret societies, government departments, people responsible for law, basically, and that's part of it. And one of the things I've sent to the Queen, to Prince Philip, to Prince Charles, Prince William, Prince Harry and the Prime Minister is a statement saying that the war in Afghanistan was unjustified, and they have not come back with a response to that. So they have now accepted in law that the war in Afghanistan was unjustified. An unjustified war is a war of aggression. It is therefore a crime, basically, per se. So we now have the means to bring Tony Blair to trial as a war criminal. And again, if people really think our society is functioning in justice, you've only got to look at that man. You know, we've seen people be put in prison in this country for stealing milk or whatever, or ice cream, I think it was, during the bloody riots. We've seen people put in prison for 4 years for a riot that didn't even happen. And yet we have Tony Blair, who's launched an unlawful war, destabilised the world, created a terrorist threat to the British people, you know, killed endless people, been involved in use of white phosphorus and depleted uranium. He's still strutting around the world stage like a bloody peacock, for God's sake. Now, I would suggest that that shows a society that has fundamentally gone wrong. And okay, people might say, well, Blair had a reason for doing it. Well, that's okay, let's get him on trial. And if it's that obvious, he can put his defence forward. As they did with me, except they didn't let me put my defence forward, of course. But yeah, let's get him on trial. If he's got justification for what he's doing, you can sing it from the rooftops during the trial, basically.
Well, we've mentioned your trial, and in a similar vein, there's been some pushing for clarity on the what's the word? The thing you sign when you join the civil service. That thing that you would.
Oh, the Official Secrets Act.
That's it. What's going on with that? And what? See, that I'm after answers here. How does that relate to your case?
The Official Secrets Act?
Well, the Official Secrets Act that they seem to be able to rely on when they want to, and not like...
Yeah, well, the point is Blair actually broke the Official Secrets Act, and I reported that to John Yates, who has come up recently again in the connection with the hacking inquiry. One of these senior policemen had to resign. I would suggest that man was under oath. I made a report of a crime, which did lead to harm to other human beings, because what Blair did was he used intelligence information without permission to justify the invasion of Iraq, basically prior to the invasion of Iraq. That meant an unlawful invasion went ahead again. So Blair broke the Official Secrets Act. He used intelligence without permission and caused harm, basically. But again, Yates chose not to actually even arrest him. Now compare that to the experience of people like my brother, who was arrested at the same time with me because I'd given him some money for safekeeping when I'd gone off abroad, basically. And this is what I mean about the law. It's a bit like we had recently, somebody had put up something from the Bible that was vaguely controversial in a cafe, and the police had come in and asked to take it down. And the police said, oh, we've got a duty. Well, where's your duty to investigate war crime? Where's your duty to establish the truth through inquiries into the death of Dr. David Kelly, into 7/7, into 9/11? And we should now be having an inquiry into the amount of assassinations going on in this country. The number of deaths recently, and again this comes up in the last 12 months, of Sean Hoare, who was actually blowing the whistle in that inquiry into the news of the world hacking, died. And the police described this death as unexplained but not suspicious. Now, to me, if it's unexplained, it's suspicious, basically. And it's amazing how these things are just swept under the carpet. Same with Christopher Shale, the party chairman for David Cameron's constituency in Oxfordshire, who died at one of the festivals in a toilet.
Glastonbury in a toilet.
Yeah, in Glastonbury in a toilet. Very suspicious. There was a judge, I think, last year who was overseeing one of these paedophile trials, and again he was found dead in the snow, wasn't he? And again the phrase they used was unexplained but not suspicious.
All I can say is God knows what Jimmy Savile knew.
Yeah, don't give it to Jimmy Savile. But the fact they kept him resting in state for 3 days indicates that perhaps they thought he was going to resurrect. I don't know. stranger things have happened, basically. Strange things have happened at sea. Yeah, so I'd say with all of these things like that, and again, I actually believe that when we're looking at what's going on in the world at the moment, we're not being told anything. We're seeing things that just flash across screens on rolling news, basically, but they're never properly reported in the bulletin, and very rarely meet the newspapers. We've recently seen that NatWest and HSB's cash line and online service interfered with, people can get their money. We've seen all sorts of strange explosions on our motorways, the most recent of which is this one on the M5 near Taunton. I mean, this isn't a Hollywood movie. Cars don't just explode, like in those movies. Something has to make them explode like that, and it's very suspicious. When I see things like that, I'm immediately very suspicious. I
can look at this in two ways. There seem to be some very extraordinary things happening. I mean, we were looking sort of 6 months ago with the Norwegian Labour Youth Party Ireland, that cracking off. At the same time, there was some guy strapping a pretend bomb on some Australian heiress. So What I'm questioning is whether these sorts of spectacularly outlandish things happen all the time and they just don't get reported on, or whether we're reporting on it now to hide things that are going on behind the scenes, or pretty much everybody is reaching a tipping point of just not being able to cope with life today.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that in the context of the riots. Now, again, a lot of the people in the mainstream media, who are largely repellent people, who have no relationship with the truth, who are far too rich, have far too much power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot throughout the ages, they're all condemning these people and saying they want something for nothing. And that is not the experience I'm encountering when I go out there. It's people actually just want a fair day's work and a fair day's pay, basically. That's what they want, and they can't find that anywhere. And they say people won't take these jobs, and I sympathise with those people. Why should you work for any pittance being exploited while bankers are charging 42 billion a year in interest for doing little more than printing money? Now, if you want to go to scroungers, go for those bankers, not the poor sods who've had the land taken off them, who've been forced into ever poorer conditions. Those aren't your enemy, those aren't the people ripping you off, it's those bankers. And again, usury is unlawful under God's law. That which is unlawful cannot be made legal. So when we go to the bankers, we're not going to the bankers capping down saying, can we tax you a bit more, can we have a bit more off you? We're going to the bankers saying, you are career criminals. You have been criminals for decades now, you have repeatedly broken the law, and therefore you're going to go to prison for a very long time unless you make good what you've stolen off the people, basically. That's the way we go to the bankers, and I'm not ashamed to, I'm not ashamed, I'll be like Putin, put the bankers in bloody prison. They're the ones who caused this, they're the ones who caused the wars and everything else. If Rupert Murdoch hadn't wanted the recent Gulf War to happen, and his papers had said that, it wouldn't have happened. That's how crazy it is. And let me be clear about this. God judges you on what you can do, what is possible, not what is impossible, yeah? So if you're in the position of, say, David Cameron or Rupert Murdoch, you're in a position where you really can exert enormous influence to stop war, yeah? In fact, when I said the thing to David Cameron, I said, use a John Lennon quote, war is over if you want it. Instead he's like, now thinks he's some glorious war leader. He's being blooded in the same way they try to blood all of them, basically. I've been plugging thread now, damn.
We were talking about bankers and
that's what you can do, yeah. And so therefore Cameron is in a position, or Rupert Murdoch was in a position, where they could have stopped war and where they can continue to stop war because that is in their position. I can't do that. I don't own a chain of national newspapers. I'm not the Prime Minister of Britain. So I can't be judged on that. I can do my bit. I can tell these people about this. I can try and embarrass them into it. The same I've done with Liz Windsor, basically, the Queen, the former Queen. I basically said to her that she's responsible for some terrible things happening in her regime, basically. Awful things, illegal wars, giving up the attempt to give away our sovereignty as a sovereign nation to allow essentially fifth columnists to come into this country and take it over. She's allowed all sorts of usury to go on, all sorts of use of the police force to repress genuine dissent. She's allowed MI5 to go around bugging and burgling their way around London, for Christ's sake. Now she has the ultimate responsibility under law. She is sworn under the oath to uphold God's law and also the true profession of the Gospels, which the Gospels talk about the arrival of a Christ. So, again, if she will not see that is wrong and do what is within her power, again, she has the power to change these things. If she does not do what is in her power, she will be brought to justice like everybody else because she deserves to. If she sees what she's done wrong and tries to stop it, that's fine by me. I'm not in it for revenge. I'm not in it to set any personal scores. Same with Blair. Blair came to me tomorrow morning and said, bloody hell, I've got this all wrong. I've been a monster. I've caused illegal wars. People are being tortured. Dear Christ, I don't know what I was doing, but now I can see that that is wrong, and I will do everything I can to expose that as being wrong. Say, fine, Tony, come on board, mate. That's all you need to do. There's no sense in bearing a grudge against a man who has seen what he has done as wrong, basically. And again, that's the problem with their legal system. It doesn't recognise genuine contrition or whatever. It's a system that is designed, and I say, people aren't aware of this, but there are people in this country who use their bonds to pay for their mortgage, to pay for their tuition fees in university and so on. Again, if you want to get the real scroungers, get it off those people. They basically got at the government and just asked for tens of thousands of pounds and they get it while you're struggling to pay your mortgage and you're struggling to put your kids through university. They're the real scroungers, not the dolly people who need that money. It's a necessity because otherwise they would starve, basically. And none of us, I'm sure, want to see anybody starving, basically.
Right.
And again, on that subject, The thing that's come out in the last 12 months that really impresses me is what I always knew in my heart, what I've been told by God, has been now being confirmed by research. That in America there is enough fallow land and roadside land to provide all the energy needs of America, the world's biggest consumer of fuel by a long way. And if hemp can do it with America, it can do it all over the world, basically. So that means we don't have to look at any of these bloody windmills. We don't have to look at bloody solar panels. We don't have to be
shale gas.
Or shale gas, do this fracking and start destroying the earth. We don't have to be in cahoots with Middle Eastern regimes like Saudi Arabia, which are barbaric, far more barbaric than Colonel Gaddafi, basically. We do not have to be in cahoots with them. We can separate from them and we can look after ourselves, basically. True freedom. And there's no argument about this, that the way this is done, much simpler. It's not like ethanol. Produced from wheat, for example. It's much easier to use, very high calorific value, and crucially it's carbon neutral. So even if there's a problem with carbon or not, we can all dispute that at the end of the day, but if you adopt a form of fuel that is carbon neutral, we're not going to get into that whole climate debate, basically. And again, if we do that in unison with taking the users out of the system, the bankers have been using this to maintain their power. This is how they bribe people, this is how they control political groups, is with money. You take away that income, they can't do that anymore. The same with the title to land. The reason that people have managed to keep massive amounts of land and get people to believe this title is because they've had an unlawful police force behind them enforcing that. But say, take away this money, make sure that policemen know that their true duty is to a man under the law and not to a corporation. We can change the world very quickly. And any, say, policeman in there who believes he's got a duty to a corporation, you know, let him carry on with that and see where he gets, basically, after everybody's sued him under the common law, basically. And I say, anybody like that, any sworn officer of the law who doesn't obey the law, automatically, straight away, you lose your pension. Straight away, you lose your pension. Simple as that.
I think we're getting a bit specific on points now that hopefully...
No, I want to get that point across to these people, that there can be no pretence, they don't know about it, they lose their pension. As far as I'm concerned, you know, the whole thing's up in anyway. And what I also want to say to people at this point as well, is it should be quite clear to everybody out there, I don't know whether it is or not, but it's certainly perfectly clear to me, that this whole system now, the giant Ponzi scheme that's been going on for 400 years, no longer has enough cash coming into it. The plan for the last last 10 years of world domination didn't happen. The truth behind those operations was ultimately, in one sense, financial, basically. That you've got a Ponzi scheme, you've got to keep the money coming in. It's like a pyramid selling scheme, where everybody puts in a fiver or whatever and it goes down and the person at the top starts getting loads of money after a while. Well, that's what we're like now, but of course the money's got to keep coming in for these people who put money into the scheme to then reap the benefits. And what they wanted to do was create their kind of regimes in places like Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan, but it really hasn't got off there. The Third World War did go on. In fact, it might be just to say the Third World War actually started with the Korean War in the early 1950s and has gone on till now. A bit like the 100 Years' War, a series of minor events that were all designed to lead to the big finale. That is not happening. They're trying to, they've talked about going to Iran again recently. That would be insanity. Anybody who thinks they're going to drop a bomb on Iran will know that there will be justice brought to them swiftly, basically. It is fundamentally wrong, unless they can bring some case that we are under attack from Iran, which they can't because Iran's too far away. We're going to have to drop that idea straight away. We're not even going to play that game of threatening people, because we shouldn't be threatening people on the world stage, basically.
Right. What I want to try and wind this up, because it could end up being 4 hours long. But basically, third and final testament, that's what you've been doing. Yeah,
that's why I keep meaning to mention this properly, but let's just prove people there is actually a book here. The Third and Final Testament, if you can see this. Don't panic, it's the Third and Final Testament. These aren't just a series of blank pages, by the way, it does actually exist. You can find it at scribid.com. David_Shayler. But just to be clear, yeah, we've got the thing "Don't Panic" on the front from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But also, it's a serious point that the world is panicking at the moment. Quite frankly, I think people watching the news must surely be able to see that our world leaders have no idea what to do. And what we see every time they meet is some mealy-mouthed form of words to try and essentially allay the inevitable collapse. But the bankers eventually see through it because no money's forthcoming. Therefore, we're on in terminal decline, basically. The only way we can reverse that decline, and let's make it absolutely clear about this, is cancel all debt. All debt is usury, it's all unlawful, it's what led to these problems. The second we cancel that debt, we start to restore a true society again.
Well, some guy in recent weeks has sort of put this challenge out that he'll pay somebody something like £250,000 if they can solve the economies that are all going tits up at the moment. What do you think would happen if you just sent him an email that said cancel all debt?
It would be interesting, I think, because they don't.
Why can't people see? Why can't
people see that's the way forward?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I compare this. I mean, I imagine there's many people in Britain who've been in a situation like me when perhaps you're in a job and you get into some situation where you need a bit more money, you've overspent a bit or whatever, so you take out an overdraft or a loan, and then suddenly some money you're not expecting doesn't come in, or you miss a payment, and suddenly it's all over the place. You're suddenly paying lots more money for what you've got, basically. And you get in that situation, and after a while, battling with it a while, you suddenly realise, I can't pay this off. And that's actually a moment of liberation, because you realise, actually, no, I'm not going to pay it off. It's up to them to come and pursue me for the money. And I've done that time and time again. I promise you, I've paid very little of the debts I've run up. And I'm very glad about that. I really am. That's, in some ways, I'm not saying it's the best way spiritually to take out money and not pay it back, because you shouldn't get involved in usury. But I wasn't fully conversant with God's law at the time, so I didn't know usury was a sin. And therefore it was quite good to be able to take money off the bankers in that way and, use it for my own enjoyment, basically, because that's what we're here for. We're under common law, you're entitled to enjoy life.
So cancel all debt.
Yeah. And I mean, people will say, good God, what will happen? Well, we've got to do it at some point. So you can't carry on going further and further into debt. There's no way we're going to pay off these debts. I mean, what people don't realise about at the moment as well, things they're lying about. They talk about when we get these little incremental growths of 0.1%, 0.2%. We haven't got into recession. But the problem is, because of the interest on the national debt, we have to actually grow at 2% just to tread water and stay even, basically. So every month we should be saying, no, actually we're 1.9% away from where we should be.
Not 0.01%
above.
Above.
Yeah, 1.9% below where we need to be, basically. And that
I do love the concept of negative growth. That's rather marvellous.
Yeah, which is recession.
Tantamount to your penis disappearing back up.
It's a bit like double-dip recession is depression. And depression was defined as 2 consecutive periods of quarters of recession. So I don't, again, I can't, they use it, it's what they've done with Black's Law Dictionary over the years. They've just redefined words so that people don't think in the same terms. But you can only continue doing that kind of nonsense for so long. I think Abraham Lincoln hit the nail on the head when he said, you can fool all the people, you can fool some of the people all the time, and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time.
Right, well, you were in danger of turning into Donald Rumsfeld then, so I think we're going to have a short break whilst we get your fluffery.